As Howard Philips Lovecraft once wrote, that which is not dead can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. You see, in this capacity, the incomprehensible scope of cosmic horror was once immortalised by the many comings and goings and wants and needs of the old gods, a concept which never could be fully grasped by the human mind. But it was a passage written in a book that harkens back to the ultimate adversary of all human life: death, the Necronomicon, the book of the dead, and one which played on a symbolic device that has been scrawled on the pages of literature since time immemorial. That of the Necromancer, the human host that blurs the boundaries between the spirit world and ours. So in that case, let's see what they're all about. Hello horror fans, what's going on? And once again, welcome back to the Scariest channel on YouTube, Top 5 Scary Videos. As per usual, I'll be your horror host Jack Finch, as today we once more return to the lore explored and take a curious look at the Necromancer. Roll the clip. For the curious amongst you, that clip of course was from The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, and in my eyes, anything, book, movie, game, whatever, that is set in Middle-earth can do no wrong. Fact. But hey, it also depicted an incredibly unique concept, that of Sauron as the Necromancer, a fledgling essence of the shadow before his whole campaign of hate and torment, one that wasn't exactly laid down in the Lord of the Rings series, but instead only hinted at by J.R.R. Tolkien 100 years prior. Put a pin in that because Sauron is an incredibly important figure in the fictional lore of the Necromancer, but again, it was an even older archetypal image, one that has happened time and time again in mythology, folklore, religion, literature, tabletop board games. The Necromancer is as old as storytelling itself, and before we dive into the bulk of their lore, it's probably best that we find out where they first began. So first and foremost, what's in a word? Because while it may seem slightly obvious, the etymology behind the Necromancer is the first and most important stop in deciphering the origin of those that speak with the dead. The word necromancy is adapted from the late Latin necromantia, which in itself is borrowed from the post-classical Greek necromenteia, a compound of the ancient Greek nekros, which means dead body, and manteia, which loosely translates to divination by means of, a diviner of those that are dead. Now, whilst the first ever use of this word occurred in a treatise known as Origin of Alexandria in the 3rd century AD, the actual origin of the classical Greek term nekia was even older still. It appeared in perhaps one of the most famous texts of the ancient world, the Odyssey, written by Homer and completed sometime around the 8th century BC, denoting an ancient Greek cult ceremonial practice known as Nikeia, a rite by which ghosts were called upon and questioned about the future. And whilst this certainly seems to be the most important starting point for our journey through necromancy and literature, still the form and function of this practice is older than even that. Because you see, the role of the Necromancer walks hand in hand with another archetypal role, that of the shaman. And don't worry, because we certainly can't cover the whole extent of the shaman as merely a footnote in a video, and we'll be taking a much deeper look at them in their own lore explored in good time. The point is, it is important to note that the Necromancer is certainly an offshoot of the shaman, and it harkens back to an ancient cultural practice that seemingly has made up an integral part of all human beings, and in turn, all life on Earth. Veneration of the dead, as well as the physical, metaphysical, or spiritual communion with those that have passed over, is perhaps one of the oldest core beliefs of human existence. It would make sense then that evidence of this necromancy was prevalent throughout the ancient world, particularly in ancient Egypt, Babylonia, Greece, and Rome. Several allusions are made in ancient records of classical necromancers addressing the dead in a mixture of high-pitched squeaking and low droning noises, comparable to the trance-like mutterings of shamanism, which suggests further that the origins of necromancy are indeed one and the same with shamanism, or at least comprised of similar rites. In his encyclopedic work Geographica, written by Greek academic and philosopher Strabo around 7 BC, he refers to the necromantia, or diviners of the dead, as the foremost leading practitioners of divination amongst the people of Persia. In short, necromancy was at the forefront of religion in much of the ancient world, and it is believed to have also been widespread amongst the people of Chaldea, Etruria, and most importantly, Babylonia, where Babylonian necromancers were denoted as Manzazu or Shah Itemu, and the spirits that they raised were called Itemu. Once again, evidence of an ancient practice, communication with the dead. And here we can bring it back to Homer's Odyssey, where these themes come to the forefront of ancient literature. In the Odyssey, under the direction of the powerful sorceress Circe, the hero Odysseus travels to the bowels of the earth, to the underworld, in order to gain an insight into his impending voyage home. Most importantly, he seeks a lost knowledge, one that could not be revealed without the wisdom of the dead. That's an important theme. By using the practice of spells that Circe taught him, Odysseus wishes to invoke and question the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, but is unable to summon the seer spirit without the aid of others. Even more astoundingly, eventually Odysseus commits fully to the necromantic ritual, where he then performs the rites of the dead around a pit and fire, sacrifices the blood of animals, and recites prayers and incantations to the ghosts and gods of the underworld. As clear as it could ever be, communion with the spirit world, Odysseus as the necromancer. Most importantly, this rite and practice of Nicaea would later form the psychological and philosophical incarnation of the necromancer that we now know, particularly in horror and fantasy literature. This image was perhaps best elaborated on by the psychoanalytic works of Carl Jung, who equated Nicaea and necromancy as the allegorical night sea journey, a metaphorical descent into the lower world, with the ultimate prize being a new, darker knowledge of the self. In many ways, the classical hero's journey was superseded by the night sea journey, an ultimate descent into the dark depths of the human consciousness, one where, compared to the cathartic process of the hero, here there is no coming back. You see, the basic practice of necromancy in ancient Greece and the wider ancient world was more of a solicitation of the dead rather than any form of exploitation. The general rite of the classical communication of the spirit world, as laid out by Odysseus, was for a figure to dig a pit, make a fire in it, offer honey, milk, wine, and then lay out the sacrifice of an animal, along with prayers to the chthonic gods such as Hecate. Throughout pretty much all of the ancient world, this practice appears time and time again in some form or another, and is one that literally became the cornerstone for a myriad of belief systems. Old Norse, Gnosticism, paganism, many necromantic rites were sacrament to them, and over hundreds of years this dead speaking function shifted and changed with the times. So then you may be scratching your head and thinking, where does the evil image of the necromancer first occur? I was expecting flowing black robes, bone white hair, and an army of skeletal archers. And the answer to that question was forged in perhaps one of the most tumultuous times in European history, the Middle Ages, and the role that the Catholic Church played in shifting the tide in the continued cultural development of necromancy. You see, not surprisingly, the Abrahamic religions took a pretty dismal view of the practice, and condemnation of necromantic rites is explicitly referred to on many occasions in their religious texts. In the Bible, it is very clearly denoted as a dark art, but strangely enough, it wasn't ever a practice that was completely eradicated by the Church. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, despite the Church being the principal advocates for its condemnation, it was the clergy who inadvertently sustained its practice, albeit by driving it underground and in turn augmenting its cultural evolution. You see, the Church didn't outright destroy necromancy, but instead refused to believe that anyone but their Abrahamic God had the power to resurrect a body or even intentionally contact a spirit. And because of that, the Church concluded that these ancient necromancers weren't actually communicating with the dead, but instead with demons, a host of nefarious forces who would deceive the magicians into believing that they were the souls of the dead. And now perhaps the image of the necromancer as a corrupted scholar or warlock owes itself as the far more nefarious archetype in contemporary literature. This is where we get the far more contemptuous conventions of the necromancer: blood sacrifices, puppets, voodoo dolls, protective circles, letters and sigils. The image of the necromancer almost as a warrior rather than a shaman, bending the will of the metaphorical demon of the dead to do their bidding rather than to gain a lost knowledge like Odysseus did in the underworld. Throughout the 1300s, reports of necromancy as a practice fell on either side of the moral and cultural line. Rare confessions of necromancy by those that were accused seemed to suggest that there was a range of what was and wasn't acceptable in relation to communing with the dead. John of Salisbury is perhaps one of the most famous historical examples of this, a philosopher accused of necromancy after a royal scandal. So was the case of Richard Kiekhefer in 1332, who was accused of necromancy after being connected to a group who were plotting to invoke the demon Beric from inside a circle made from strips of cat skin. Yeah, it seemed that the ancient message may have been a little bit lost in translation. You see, the Middle Ages truly were a grey area as to what was and what wasn't acceptable in terms of ceremonial magic, and many of these grey areas are what have laid the basis for esoteric knowledge in modern culture and literature. You see, it didn't end there though, and it was with the rise of spiritualism throughout the 1800s where the image of the necromancer once again shifted, this time toward a kinder, more gentler form of communing with the dead. This is where the seance came to the forefront of popular practice, and instead of dead bodies as laid out by the necromancy of the Middle Ages, this time it was live mediums that acted as conduits for the dead. Now, whilst this was a historical period that was certainly rife with charlatans and grifters who would seek to exploit the shared reverence for the dead that has seemingly been ingrained in our cultural psyche since the dawn of time for monetary gain, it is also part of the gothic connotations of necromancy that are so common today. Skulls, candles, shadow ceremonies, tapping the bones. Throughout the turn of the 19th century and later still, necromancy literally got a facelift, and part of that facelift is the archetypal necromancer that we understand in today's popular culture. But beneath the bones, the form and function remains the same. And this is where it is difficult to pinpoint, because when we look at modern literature, video games, tabletop and television included, the necromancer is at times all of these very same archetypes laid out throughout history. Whether it is the playable character class in the Diablo series, an orchestrator of the dead who harnesses the corpses of the deceased to do their bidding, the unwitting Ash in Sam Raimi's Army of Darkness, or even in Brian Lumley's Necroscope series, where the necromancer is instead augmented back to its original form as an individual who can communicate with the dead as equals rather than adversaries, all of them remain the same. Reverence of the dead is a tale as old as time, but deep beneath that core belief system is a far more important cultural reminder. Those that forget history are doomed to repeat it, and the dead keep it. Well, there we have it folks, our most recent destination, this whistle stop tour of the lore explored. Obviously there is much more to necromancy, but hey, feel free to dig deeper for yourself, pun intended. Before we depart from today's video, let's first take a quick look at some of your more creative comments from the last lore explored video, The King in Yellow. Rodney Kelly says, "Why do I keep finding the yellow sign in the snow?" Well, I think you know the answer to that question, Rodney. You are a funny man, you are indeed, and please don't eat it. Sage Pilgrim says, "I adore this series and this character." Well, that is incredibly kind of you, Sage Pilgrim, and I adore the fact that you're enjoying this series, because, to be honest, I am too. And finally, Christopher Smith says, "Your king has heard you, mortal." Not again. Well, on that note, unfortunately that's all we've got time for in today's video. Cheers for sticking around all the way until the end. If you were a fan of this video, or just top 5 scary videos in general, then please be a dear and hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscriber, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. As per usual, I've been your horror host, Jack Finch. You've been watching top 5 scary videos, and until next time, you take it easy.